All right. Well, thank you so much, Yasmin. Again, fantastic to be here with you and the constituency that has joined us today. And so I want to thank you all for taking time out to really talk about what is perhaps the most there's high visibility obviously around cybersecurity in general as it relates to small businesses, but certainly in the context of the current sort of cyber threat landscape that we find ourselves in, the pervasive of cyber attacks, the unique challenges that small businesses face as a result, all of which sort of leads into this discussion about Project Spectrum and our affiliation and the fact that we're supported by the Department of Defense Office of Small Business Programs, and really advocated for heavily within the DoD and the DIB writ large for the purposes of helping small businesses, again, with their training, tool provisioning that we provide, as well as a myriad of other communications resources, be it newsletters, blogs, white papers, videos, educational videos about cybersecurity. And we do all of this at no cost, right? As part of our partnership with the DoD, Office of Small Business Programs, we do this at absolutely no cost to small businesses. And when I talk about some of the exciting elements of that and what that means, frankly, in terms of how it's going to help small businesses work to increase not only their cybersecurity hygiene, but of course, meet those compliance requisites that we know are coming down the pike as it relates to, for example, CMMC or the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. And hopefully that is not new to anyone on the call, but if it is, don't worry, we will dive in a bit and talk about that and what that compliance journey looks like. We'll talk about that as well. But really, what I want to start with is really talking about the fact that we are closely tied to the Department of Defense Office of Small Business Programs, right? And that is a huge piece of what allows us to be able to offer these resources at no cost. And the department's standpoint really is, we know that in the context of cybersecurity for small businesses, it can seem as one more barrier to entry, right? For those that are looking to contract with the DoD, those that are looking to work in the defense agency space, right? And so with that, one of the things that the DoD, as you all know, did back in January of last year is they issued the small business strategy, right? And in that small business strategy for the Department of Defense, it laid out in no uncertain terms really three critical objectives. Number one, promoting this idea of a unified management approach. Number two, meaning a unified management approach within the DoD for the purposes of assisting small businesses. The other thing was really beefing up the provisioning of services to really lay clear the landscape of what it looks like for small businesses to be able to participate in the DoD. And so that, and then the third objective really talked about outreach and how do we touch with these small businesses, and specifically in and around cybersecurity. Project Spectrum is named directly in that third objective, specifically 3.2 of the DoD Small Business Strategy, as the go-to resource for small businesses, again, to beef up their security posture. First of all, become educated and aware of not only the type of threats that are out there, which we'll talk about here in a second, but also the provisioning that exists at no cost to them to help them beef up their cybersecurity compliance posture. And so that's just laying some context for how it is that we're here talking with you today. While we have a focus on helping small businesses within the defense industrial base and those that are looking to enter the defense industrial base, our resources at Project Spectrum are certainly applicable to any business of any size. And I want to emphasize that. We do have a laser focus, obviously, on small and medium-sized businesses because we know there are particular threat vectors and we feel we can have the greatest impact there. Now, that doesn't preclude the fact that we work with many of the big six on various different engagements, their respective, OSDBUs and offices of small business programs. We've worked with many of the big six, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and more. And what we've done is we know that those subcontractor flow down clauses, right, meaning the DFARS, and how that pertains to small businesses, particularly those subcontractors, those sub-tier contractors, as well as primes, obviously. But it's in the context of those primes that we're saying, hey, ultimately, primes are going to be held responsible, obviously, for what their subcontractors are or are not meeting in terms of compliance requirements. And so in that regard, we've partnered with those primes to help their constituency, their small sub-tier contractors understand exactly what it is that they will be held to. And again, just to emphasize that, to again help folks that have existing contracts stay in the defense industrial base, stay able to compete for those contracts and win those contracts, and also helping those that are looking to enter, right? Make sure that looks like a smooth transition in terms of their cybersecurity piece and hygiene. And so with that, I'm going to jump right in and talk a little bit about kind of what it is that we're seeking to do. Well, obviously, we're seeking to help businesses with their cybersecurity. We want to first and foremost be able to educate those businesses on the landscape of the cybersecurity threats, right? Looking at those sophisticated hackers and nation states that are indeed targeting even the smallest of businesses. That's, by the way, one of the misnomers. What I hear as I travel around the country and as I talk to many audiences, virtually and otherwise, it's that myth that my company is too small. They're not concerned about me. They're going after the big guys, right? They want the big secrets and what have you. And nothing could be further from the truth in that those small businesses are not the prime target. In fact, they are, because of what information they handle. We'll see that on the subsequent slide. But it's providing an overview of federal regulations, safeguarding data and information there. Being able to really touch with companies, have them understand, the regulations, right? The DFARS, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations supplement. How do these things pertain to them now, right? And how are they going? What is it going to look like as we move forward, right? Briefing businesses again on the CMMC process. So the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification process. It has changed, right, over the last several years. And, as it changes, that there needs to be a constant information flow and synthesizing of that information in a palatable way that small businesses and people who may be novices, to this entire process, that they can actually understand and digest and determine actionable next steps, right? So again, the scoping assessments, gap assessments, we'll talk a bit about that. The supplier performance risk system scores and how to get certified. We'll talk a bit about that as well. And then finally, again, providing an overview on how Project Spectrum can help with the CMMC journey. And it is, in fact, a journey, right? Regardless of which level you may be pursuing. Educating businesses on the services that are provided by Project Spectrum and how it is that you can use those services to really have a substantive impact, not only on eliminating the cost that would otherwise be shouldered by small businesses on the preparatory piece, which is where Project Spectrum really, really lives, right? We're focused intently on that, preparing small businesses, educating them so that by the time they go for certification, if in fact that's required, and we'll talk a bit about when that is and when it's not, as it relates to CMMC, but when they're going for certification, that they're lock, stock, and barrel on exactly what it is they need to know to be able to be ready to obtain that certification for CMMC. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the threat landscape. Well, we know that some 40% of all cyber attacks are targeting small and medium-sized companies. And of those, only 28% we find have plans in place to be able to mitigate those attacks. Well, that's puzzling and troubling right there, right? We know that there are 3/4 of the breaches that are caused by human error, right? So again, getting back to this idea of, that's largely, by the way, I think attributable to, again, education awareness, right? What requirements do I need to meet? How do I meet them? How do I know what my infrastructure should look like? How do I determine gaps, right? We'll get into that. We talk about the cost of cyber attacks, and the range is obviously staggering, right? Up to 653,000 for an individual attack, right? That it can cost a small and medium-sized company, which can be crippling, right? And then just 14% of small and medium-sized businesses have proper insurance, right, to cover those cyber attacks. And so that's another piece that's becoming more and more popular now. These insurance the policies that companies can obtain to be able to engage and leverage the types of insurances that are there in the case that they are attacked. But obviously, we want to mitigate that as to the greatest extent possible on the front end. So again, why are small and medium-sized businesses targeted? Well, we talked a little bit about it, but intellectual property, right? Access to sensitive government information. Certainly, the interconnection with larger defense contractors is absolutely germane as to why small businesses are targeted. Obviously, the access to the supply chain writ large, political and ideological motivations. When we talk about just two in particular here, that interconnection with larger defense contractors, and I kind of hinted at it earlier with sub-tier contracting and those flow-down clauses, but really more so on the fact that, these would-be attackers, right? These bad actors, right? They know that if they can get in and penetrate those smaller companies, that perhaps they can use bits and pieces of information there to then be able to target those larger companies. And so that becomes a huge piece of this as well. When we talk about a critical piece here, that is understanding FCI and CUI data. This is a critical piece because it actually tells us on the Project Spectrum side and for companies, it tells us what level of compliance companies are going to be going after, right? So if we can understand the types of information that companies are handling or would be handling in the context of, for example, of a certain contract pursuit, right, or contracting strategy or acquisition strategy, well, then we know what types of, we can then be informed to an extent as to what level of compliance they would need to seek in order to be compliant to be able to do business with the DoD. All right, so federal contract information, again, consistent with the FAR clause or Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause 52.204.21. We know that that's dealing with FCI or federal contract information that is, of course, not classified, but information that is still provided by or generated for the government under a contract. So you can think of federal contract information as a subset of controlled unclassified information, right? And you see some examples there to the right. Think RFP or RFI responses, any sort of process documentation, org charts. Those things would be federal contract information, or examples of it rather. And as we talk about controlled and classified information, conversely, the DFARS clause 252.204/7012, which is what companies are beholden to at this point, right? And as of right now, that has been since December 31st of 2017. And it talks about, again, this broad category of sensitive information while unclassified that requires safeguarding and dissemination security controls pursuant to federal laws, regulations, and policies. And again, that's consistent with the language within DFARS clause 252.204/7012. And as you can see, some examples there for CUI on the right. That first bullet, I'll just caveat that when we talk about proprietary business information, that is when it's in the hands of the government, right? That it becomes an example of CUI. But again, SBU, we've known about that, sensitive but unclassified, that third bullet there under CUI examples, FOUO, some of the more common ones. These are all examples of CUI, right? And again, this becomes hugely critical in the context of foreign ownership, control, and influence as well, because again, these types of information are what many of these bad actors and would-be attackers are looking at, right? And they're trying to aggregate that information into something greater, right? Well, FOCI, or foreign ownership, control, and influence, we talk about that being really affecting a company's ability to qualify for and maintain eligibility to contract with the DoD. And if you look at that second bullet there, 50% of all espionage within the U.S. manufacturing is due to some sort of FOCI. Well, that's huge, right? We know how critical of the three sort of core sectors for the defense industrial base. We talk about knowledge-based services, we talk about research and development, we talk about the manufacturing sector being those critical pillars, right? Sectors within the DIB, right? And where we see a lot of activity being produced by those key contractors for the DIB. And so with that, we know that in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, specifically Section 875, talked about this idea of establishing a program for the demonstration of commercial due diligence tools, techniques, and processes. And this becomes really, really important when we think about, again, the attempts by malicious foreign actors to gain undue access to or foreign ownership and control or influence over a business, right? So while you've probably heard that, yes, the government, U.S. government does encourage foreign investment when it makes sense for certain companies, but obviously there have to be right and left delimiters, right, as to what types of information do these companies have access to because of their investment, right? And then what are the derivative impacts of foreign entities having access to U.S. government company information, right? Or companies rather in the U.S. And what are the sort of downstream effects, if you will, from that. After you register for Project Spectrum, again, you're going to have access to this foreign ownership, control, and influence training course. You're going to find that there's a recurring theme, and that is, how to properly identify, evaluate the impact of, and then reduce the associated risks as it relates to foreign ownership, control, and influence. And let's talk now about the CMMC model, right? So we're talking about three distinct levels of compliance for CMMC. Level one being, again, that foundational level, where in fact companies are only handling FCI, right? So federal contract information only. CMMC level two, that's where we're talking about enhanced data safeguarding. And so it's called controlled and classified information that's being handled there. And it's either controlled and classified information at a prioritized or non-prioritized data acquisition, right? And that's a distinction that DoD is going to make in those solicitations that will be coming out. CMMC level three, we're talking about at the expert level. Again, high capacity and safeguarding CUI data. Again, these are for the highest priority DoD programs, right? So you'll find, if you look at that sort of graphic at the bottom there, that from an assessment perspective, at level three, it's going to be handled by on a triennial basis by a government-led institution called the DIBCAT. We'll learn more about that as well. But you can see the various levels and the associated controls. At level one, we're talking about 17 practices. At level two, we're talking about 110 practices that are aligned with NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, SP, or Special Publication 800-171. And again, at level two, again, pointing out that distinction because it has very different implications if in fact it is deemed a CUI at a prioritized acquisition level or CUI at a non-prioritized acquisition level. And as you can see, by that non-prioritized acquisition level, what you begin to see right around here is that self-attestation suffices, and that's huge, and we'll talk more about that here momentarily. At level one, FCI, again, not critical to national security, but still important information that needs to be protected. And in that case, annual self-attestation suffices as well. At level two, when we talk about assessments, we're talking about needing, at the prioritized acquisition level, we're talking about needing to meet with what we call a certified third-party assessor organization, right? And these can be found on the Cyber AB or the Cyber Accreditation body's website, and hopefully my counterparts can pop that in the chat for you so you have a link to get to the Cyber AB, but it is the cyberab.org. They have a marketplace tab on their site that'll tell you exactly those entities that they've certified to then be able to certify you as a small business. When we call them C3PAOs, or Certified Third Party Assessor Organizations. All right, so let's jumping a little bit more into CMMC level 1. And here we're talking about, again, annual self-attestation being a sufficient to meet the requirement for what is deemed to be CMMC level 1. And what does that mean? Well, if as a small business, I'm going after CMMC level 1, I just need to be able to meet all of the 17 control requirements delineated across those 6 control families. We'll talk about that as well. I just need to make sure that I'm meeting that. When I take that self-assessment, I need to make sure I'm meeting those requirements and make sure that I'm uploading my information into the supplier performance risk system. All right. We'll talk more about that as well. But again, to be compliant, the contractor needs all findings to result in a met or in a status, right? So either you're meeting the requirements or they're not applicable. And we'll talk about the scoping assessment that, again, helps you delineate what is in scope and what is out of scope. All right. When conducting self-assessments, right? So when you're conducting the self-assessments, right, a CMMC certification is not required at this level because the self-assessment itself, right, suffices. If you're meeting those requirements, right, you're going to upload that to the supplier performance risk system, and that satisfies the requirement at level 1. So you do not need to meet with the C3PAO. There is no sort of official certification that's issued, right? And again, you can register at Product Spectrum at no cost to conduct these self-assessments, essentially taking the test, if you will, before the real test, right? Or making sure that the requirements are being met. All right, so let's talk about level 2, all right? CMMC level 2, all right? There is a bifurcation, right, between, again, non-prioritized acquisitions at CUI or for CUI or controlled and classified information. And then there's prioritized acquisitions, right? Well, let's talk about the non-prioritized first, because this is great for any small business that's looking to save money, and I know we all are, right? Well, again, annual self-attestation suffices. DoD-CIO, who governs the CMMC program, right? They have deemed that if your acquisition is at what they call a non-prioritized CUI data acquisition, right? And that, again, will be delineated in those RFPs or in those solicitations. And certainly your contracting officer or the procurement officer assigned to that RFP that you may be looking to pursue would certainly have that information. But in those cases of a non-prioritized acquisition, self-assessments suffice, right? Businesses, again, are going to create financial savings by using the tools, the training, the cyber advisory preparatory services that we'll talk about as well. CMMC certification, again, is not required. There is no certification at this point, again, because you're able to self-attest, right? And upload those scores to the supplier performance risk system. I'll just drop this footnote and we'll see a screenshot later. But the supplier performance risk system, we've written a blog as to what small businesses need to do in order to be able to complete that, satisfy that process, right? So how do I upload my score to SPURS? Make sure you register at productspectrum.io and visit our blogs. We have a blog that we walk through, and it'll walk you exactly through what you need to do in no uncertain terms. All right, so that's the non-prioritized acquisition for CUI at level 2. Let's talk about a prioritized acquisition for CUI at level 2, okay? And in this regard, we know that a certification must be performed by a CMMC certified third-party assessor, as we discerned, right? To do that, again, you're going to go to the Cyber AV, you're going to visit there, you're going to look at the certified third-party assessors that are out there. I believe there's more than 50 out there at present. Again, you're still going to be able to take advantage of all the savings by having done the preparatory work, right? Because even though self-attestation does not suffice in this point, meaning to meet the requirement, that you still have to go for the certification piece, right? Meaning you have to meet with that C3PO, they have to look at what you have and sort of officially certify you, right? But you're still able to leverage the information from that self-assessment, right? To be able to understand where the gaps are. You know, what are the things that I need to focus on? And not only that, but you'll be able to then be able to take the attending trainings to speak to those gaps that you've been able to find in the self-assessment, right? And between where your existing infrastructure is and what you want to then move to, right? So you're able to do that. You're also able to leverage our cyber advisors preparatory services. So you're able to balance and field questions off of our cyber advisor team, right? If you maybe have a question about the scoping assessment, maybe you have a question about the self-assessment, maybe you have a question about your specific entity, right? And things that you're concerned about, whether or not something applies to you, right? Those are questions you can actually leverage our cyber advisory team for as well. The assessments in the case of a prioritized acquisition have to be uploaded to a different repository, and that is the Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Services System, otherwise referred to as EMAS. So that's a different system, and that's a different track, if you will, between, again, if you're at level 2 for CMMC, whether it's a prioritized or non-prioritized acquisition, you can see some of the differences there. But in either case, the takeaway here is that we at Project Spectrum are going to more than prepare you for being ready and understanding where those gaps are between your existing infrastructure and meeting the requirements for the respective levels of compliance, in this case, level 2. All right, so let's talk about level 3 then, right? So at level 3, what we know is that we're talking about the highest priority programs. We're talking about still CUI, right? Just at a much higher level, right? At a level that necessitates much more scrutiny, if you will, of the requirements, because there's implications because of the level of information that's being handled, right? The highest priority programs. It's a 3-year cycle. Every 3-year, a triennial assessment that's required for certification. This is a level at which obviously an official certification is issued. The difference between level 3 and level 2, aside from, again, the highest priority programs, is the fact that from an assessment perspective, whereas we saw here in level 2 and split B, right? We saw that you're going to have to meet with a C3PAO, right? A certified third-party assessor organization that, again, you're going to find on the cyberab.org site. And level 3, from an assessment perspective, it's going to be handled by the government agency within DCMA called the Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center, right? Or DIBCAC, as it were, right? That's who's going to handle that assessment. Every 3 years, you're going to have that certification renewal there as well. All right. And what we learned with level 3, by the way, on 26 December, you will recall that there was a proposed rule that was issued by DoD-CIO, right? As it relates to CMMC. And that and along with that proposed rule, they actually finally published the CMMC level 3 scoping guidance, right? So that's fantastic. That we didn't have until then. So now we have that. We'll be adding that to our site very, very soon here, as our cyber advisors go through that and look at what that's going to mean for companies that are pursuing level 3. But again, this is one of the great things about Project Spectrum. We're housing all this information in one site, right? ProjectSpectrum.io. That's how you're going to register with us. That's how you're going to get to us to be able to leverage the resources at no cost for you. All right, so we've looked at all 3 of the levels for CMMC. Let's look at a compliance scenario. We'll just take level 1 in this case, utilizing or understanding first the compliance requirements, but then of course utilizing Project Spectrum. And so there's really 8 steps at the outset. There's identifying the appropriate level of compliance, which again, we're going to do leveraging that understanding of, are you handling FCI? Are you handling CUI? Right? We're going to then move to conducting a scoping assessment, leveraging the DoD's tools for scoping assessment, which again, we have housed on our site. You're going to then move from that scoping assessment to discern what it is that is in bounds and out of bounds as it relates to your particular compliance journey. We're going to then look at step 3. We're going to conduct the actual self-assessment. And from that self-assessment, we're going to be able to glean salient details about what controls that we're maybe not meeting, right? And versus what we are meeting, right? And from that, we're going to be able to do some gap analysis in step 4, right? And it's from that gap analysis that we can then move to a remediation plan. So we've identified where the gaps are. Well, let's look at what our remediation plan is going to look like. Well, maybe there's certain courses that Project Spectrum is going to have on the site that are going to largely speak to what you've been able to discern from that gap analysis in step 4, right? We have micro courses you'll hear me talk about here in a little bit. We have, which are, by the way, more core CMMC core control specific, right? In other words, they speak really specifically to a particular area that you may be not compliant with at that time, right? And so we have that. But we also have courses, full-length courses, if you will, that speak to broader categories of how it is that you can get compliant. So whether it's system security plan fundamentals, plans of action and milestones, we'll talk more about that as well. But it's from that gap analysis onto that remediation plan that you're able to then not only discern where the holes are at step 4, but at step 5, being able to figure out, okay, let's put together my remediation plan. And Project Spectrum has templates to help you with that as well. Implementing the security controls obviously is the next logical step now that we've figured out what our remediation plan is going to be. And we actually going to go and do it, right? Implement those security controls. And then subsequently on step 7, we're going to make sure that we're preparing documentation and evidence of the fact that we've implemented those security controls, right? The fact that we're meeting compliance, we want to document what that looks like, how are we doing it, and if it's ever needed in the case of an audit, right, which we know can happen, if it's ever needed, by the time, for example, you get to that C3PAO, you will have already had a lot of your documentation in place for those controls that you are meeting, right? And so you've got that step lock, stock, and barrel. And then finally, in the case of level 1, right, it's different for level 2, depending on whether it's prioritized or not prioritized. But at level 1, you're going to upload that self-assessment information. We'll talk about what that looks like as well. You're going to upload that to the supplier performance risk system, right? And so just a little bit more on level 1 as it relates to those steps that I just walked through. Again, it's determining the type of data that you're managing for the contract, right? Well, we know it's FCI if you're at level 1. And again, just a very clear discernment, or hopefully clear discernment between the fact that, again, businesses should consult with their contracting officer for clauses in their existing contracts, right? We're going to prepare you. We're going to give you the guidance. But as it relates to specific procurements and specific contract pursuits, you certainly want to regard your contracting officer or the procurement officer in the case of an RFP as the authority for that particular effort. But again, federal entity requesting services from a business is going to help you determine that FCI versus CUI requirement there. Whether it's an RFQ, or request for quote, RFP, or supporting contract documentation. As it relates to step 2, that self-assessment, this is just a visual of what it looks like. Again, as I mentioned earlier, and level 1, the scoping assessment, it's going to focus on FCI assets, right, for level 1. It's going to cover 6 family domains or control families, as I mentioned. It's going to be 51 questions long, right? So you know what that looks like. Versus the scoping assessment for level 2 is going to cover CUI assets, right? So that's the biggest distinction between level 1 and level 2, is that level 1, we're dealing with FCI. Level 2, we're dealing with CUI. In this case, covering 14 family domains or control families over some 69 questions. Now, big difference, and this is why we put this here, even though we're talking about sort of a compliance track or journey for level 1, we put this here for cross-referencing purposes. So for level 2, at the scoping assessment, what you'll notice in that 4th bullet there is that you have to produce a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones if in fact you're not meeting any requirements there, right? So that's hugely important. Why? Because Project Spectrum has the resources to be able to educate you on not only what that system security plan is by way of the training course that we offer, but we also have the plan of action and milestones course as well. So you understand exactly what should go into that and how that all works, right? So it's hugely beneficial to be registered and to have access to that, again, at absolutely no cost. I really can't foot stomp that enough. We talk about the conducting of the self-assessment. This is a visual of what that looks like, right? So on the right-hand side, the largest box that you see there, you're going to be able to hover over that tooltip. You're going to be able to then glean a little bit about what that specific question is asking you. So in this case, it's saying, do you limit system access to authorized users? Processing, acting, or on behalf of authorized users and devices, including other systems. Well, if you didn't know what that meant, you'd hover over that tooltip that we created, and it would explain to you a little bit more about that. And then if for whatever reason you still didn't understand it, you would be able to then look at the explainer video that you see there in the upper right, that little small square that says authorized access control, because that's what that one's talking about. And that's just a little, 3.5 minute long video that would help you discern what exactly that authorized access control is all about, right? So we thought that would be helpful. Again, this idea, by the way, sort of the underpinning of what I'm telling you with all these helpful things that we kind of thought through intently and built into these tools is so that it lends to this larger point and vision that we have, that ProjectSpectrum.io is going to empower small businesses to be able to take the bull by the horns, if you will, understand the requirements that are being met, and then follow our respective training to then be able to speak to exactly what you would need to do in order to be able to meet the requirements here, right? And so again, we're empowering those small businesses to be able to do that in a way that's going to save money, right? Because you don't have to wait around for somebody to meet with you or anything like that. We have folks that are at the ready to meet with you. But if you have the knowledge, right, the education, training, you have the tools, right, which was walking through here with the self-assessment, you can begin moving out on this yourself, right? You can begin trudging forward yourself. And again, as you have concerns or questions, or maybe you're still not understanding something, you can reach out to our cyber advisory team. But that's just a little more there. And then the gap analysis, right? So this is a critical piece, right? So Project Spectrum is going to help you produce a findings report. Well, what is that? That's going to help me understand exactly where I am falling short on controls that are required for the respective level, in this case, level 1, right? Businesses are going to use that findings report to do that gap analysis. They're going to be able to identify control gaps and identify those that report in either a not met or no status. That's huge, right? Because we're going to tell you exactly, you're going to know exactly if, in fact, you're meeting what's required, right? You're going to be able to review our micro lessons, okay? These are, again, those core CMMC core control specific training courses, smaller bite-sized training courses that speak to those particular controls that you might not be meeting there. Again, aligning gaps with CMMC level requirements. And then as we talk about the development of a remediation plan, right? These are those templates I was telling you about that we're going to be able to help you with. Again, developed to address and rectify, identify security gaps, as well as deficiencies or vulnerabilities, right? It's going to be able to outline specific actions, resources, timelines, steps necessary to close those gaps and enhance security. And so you can see the bullets here. I won't go through each of them, but you can see that from the point of identifying those gaps to the point of being able to test and validate, right? Document your remediation efforts, determine continuous improvement, that Kaizen philosophy that is so built into what we're trying to do at Project Spectrum, this idea of continuous monitoring, continuous improvement. How do we do that? What you see on the right there is a screenshot of the micro lessons, just some of them, whether it's authorized access control, transaction, and function control, external connections, right? These are all things that are going to speak to what you're going to be able to have found in that gap analysis, so that you can develop that remediation plan and ultimately implement those security controls. Speaking of implementing those security controls, again, everything from using the CMMC assessment guides, preceded, we say, by the scoping guides first, right? The scoping assessments, or the guides rather, and then using the actual assessment, right? For CMMC, in this case for level 1. You see just a screenshot on the right of what those look like. But the planning and preparation, learning and applying the DoD risk management. One of the things that Project Spectrum prides itself on is being able to really meet small businesses where they are, right? We realize that you may not have a CISO, right? You may not have a director of IT. You may not have the resources that larger companies have. And so we have at the ready those cyber advisors that can help you understand what this is. We have a lot of the tooling built into the assessment and built into ProjectSpectrum.io for you to be able to get to a lot of that yourself. But we have those cyber advisors at the ready to help you, with the various stages of the process. And so preparing documentation and evidence. Again, some of the templates as well that you see there to the right as an example of those. But one of the things is, looking at what we call your network topology, and that's a fancy way of saying how are things structured in your environment, right? How are you transmitting? How are you storing? How are you processing data, right? And again, those cyber advisors can help you with that as well. One of the great ways you can reach out to us, you see in the very lower left there, is outreach@projectspectrum.io. Again, at no cost, we'll field those inquiries that you may have. But again, we ask that you register with us first and foremost at projectspectrum.io. And again, we talked about uploading the scores to the supplier performance risk system, in this case, level 1. You see that first box to the leftmost. That's going to tell you, for example, in the case of a NIST 800-171 assessment, which we have for that as well. We have the assessment for that as well. And you'll see the information that they're looking for there. So what they're not looking for is the actual self-assessment itself, right? They don't need all the questions. They just want the assessment date, the score, the scope, and as you can see, some other guidance there. And again, all of that you'll be able to see and understand by reading our blog on how to enter your Project Spectrum NIST 800-171 score into SPURS, which is hugely helpful. So what are our offerings at a glance? Well, we talked about a couple of things. One of the things I'll talk about here is our self-assessment toolkit, right? We talked about that, but the cyber readiness dashboard for the self-assessment. So what you're going to be able to see in a dashboard option that we've created on the site is that you're able to bookmark various areas of the site that you may have been engaged with. So whether you were looking at our training courses or specifically a specific training course, whether you were looking at our blogs, our newsletters, right, that we publish, or news articles rather that we publish. If you were engaged in some activity with a micro course, you're able to bookmark those areas so that you can kind of see those in a composite window. If, for example, you left in the middle of a training course, had to run away, you come back later, it's all there. But really where the efficacy, I think, really is worth noting for this, as it relates to the self-assessments, is that you can see the progression of effort from one assessment to the next. And so when you first come into Project Spectrum, you might say, you know what, I'm going to take a self-assessment, not having leveraged any of the training, any of the resources, any of the tools on Project Spectrum. I'm going to take a self-assessment just to see where I stand relative to the requirements for the respective level of compliance that I'm pursuing, if in fact you know that, right? And so you'll look at your score at that point, and then you will have incorporated the training. You will have looked into the micro courses. You will have maybe taken advantage of some of the cyber advisory services for things you had questions about. You may have read some of the blogs and became more knowledgeable about certain areas pertaining to your compliance journey. And then you take that subsequent self-assessment, right? And then you figure out, wow, I've been able to increase my score by X, Y, and Z. And you kind of can see for yourself and, throughout that progression, right? That, okay, this is working. I can see where I've identified those gaps, but not only that, I've been able to incorporate the training subsequently. And now I can see where my score has improved, all in that dashboard, which I think is incredible. The SPURS score, we talked, I think, a good bit about that, the remediation plan templates, system security plan templates, plans of action and milestones, right? So the plans of action and milestones, the long and short is, we've created a course to walk you through exactly what that looks like. Meaning, if for whatever reason, right, you're not at that minimum threshold score of 80% on your CMMC level 2 assessment, for example, right? Which has been deemed the minimum score to be acceptable, right? 80%. If you're not at that, or rather, excuse me, even if you are at that, you're going to identify what that other 20% encompasses. Well, that's going to be codified on a plan of action and milestones so that you know, okay, here are the things I have to work on, right? And here's what my trajectory is going to look like as I work on those things, and I capture that through a plan of action and milestones, right? Hugely critical. Can't say enough about that. Apex Counselor PowerPoint presentation, Project Spectrum instructional playbook. That's where we're putting together templates to be able to help you as you kind of move through your compliance journey. We understand that however your infrastructure looks for your company, it's a snapshot in time, right? What we're intently focused on is making sure that, yes, you check the boxes, that you meet the compliance requirements that are requisite to being able to do business with DoD, and that will be sort of finalized as we edge ever closer, right, to implementation of CMMC 2.0. But it's this larger point of making cyber compliance this habitual, piece of your journey, that basically you think about it just as much as you think about the bottom line in terms of profitability for your company, right? That you think about it as much as you think about anything else, if not more so, because you understand that if you're not protecting your cyber compliance, your cyber compliance hygiene, you're not protecting your environment, the environment in which you're exchanging and transmitting, storing, and processing all kinds of data, that has implications that are reverberating, right? And crippling, frankly, in many cases for small businesses, right? So that cybersecurity training and education becomes critical. Again, I talked about the blogs and newsletters. And then, of course, briefings just like this, where we're moving about specific sectors where we know there's a small business concern. We're touching with their partners at NSA Cyber Collaboration Center, who have great tools, for example, like protective DNS or protective domain name services, at no cost, by the way, that can help small businesses, again, in one more way, help to thwart those particular threat vectors that we know are aimed at those small businesses. We're working with our partners in the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, or the MEP, as it were, right? We have landing pages on our site for the Small Business Administration, for the MEP, right? For the DoD Mentor Protege Program, the Cybersecurity Pilot, right? Where we're working with those companies over a 2-year period that have eligible agreements. They're already paired up with their mentors, right? Those protege companies can come in can apply for the Cybersecurity Pilot Program, where we work with them over a 2-year period, really hand in glove, right? Helping them not only understand where the gaps are, but then also helping them with a compliance training plan to move forward, right? And so that's another hugely beneficial program. Does require some effort, does require some time for the company to invest, right? 7 to 10 hours per week on average, right? But again, working with us, we can help you get to the level that you want to get to. And again, that's specifically for the DoD Cybersecurity Pilot Program, that companies who are already in the Mentor Protege Program for DoD, 2 separate programs. But if they have an agreement for the Mentor Protege Program, they are then eligible to apply for the Cybersecurity Pilot Program. And so that's another huge thing that Project Spectrum is intently involved with as part of our partnership with DoD. What I want to talk about next is how you can connect with us. Well, we're doing training webinars. We're doing cyber circuit events, right? Where we're bringing industry professionals in from within and around the defense industrial base, the federal agencies and the government writ large, to talk about all things germane to small businesses. Obviously, with the tinge towards cybersecurity subject matter, but again, all things that can help small businesses in their journey to be able to do business with DoD and be successful. All right, the training webinars, those are more focused on, for example, different levels of CMMC, where we actually walk you through some of the particulars there. Not as robust as, intentionally so, as the actual CMMC course offerings that we offer. CMMC, for example, level 1 course offerings, but we have those CMMC level 1 webinars, level 2 webinars that we're going to be doing that give you a solid amount of information that then precipitate, obviously, wanting to get into even more as you trudge forward to your respective compliance levels there and the attending compliance requirements. So projectspectrum.io is how you're going to meet with us. It's how you're going to join with us. It's how you're going to be able to take advantage of the resources. So register there. We'll ask you some basic information about your company. And subsequent to that information, or gathering that information from you, you will then have access to the site in almost its entirety, with the exception of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership section of the site. And for that, that does require a separate sub-registration. But again, it's at no cost. So if you're a small manufacturer, if you work in any of the operational technology environments, that you think are applicable to DoD, that's a great area for you to start. We actually have 2 videos on that site that kind of walk you through, what it is that we're doing there. Again, that's really meant to be a self-directed platform for those small manufacturers, but that's yet another way you can connect with us. And then, of course, on social media, we're there on LinkedIn, Twitter. We have a YouTube channel where we post kind of animated vignette style videos. They're kind of a repository of videos that we found to be helpful. Again, looking at different ways that we can create and present information to our constituency. We know everyone, people learn differently, right? That's one of the things we've learned, whether they're auditory, whether they're visual learners. We want to be able to speak to that in as many modalities as possible. And so with that, you know how to connect with us. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. What I'll say is that we are intently focused on our partnership with all of the 97 Apex accelerators nationwide, right? Director Mita, the Office of Small Business Programs lead there, one of the things he's always championed is that, we envision the Apex accelerators as being very, very critical on the front lines, obviously dealing with all things pertinent to small businesses, but specifically for gaining knowledge about, how to become procurement ready, how to be ready to do business with the defense industrial base. Well, a huge piece of that obviously is cybersecurity and understanding what needs to be met and what will need to be met as we move forward ever closer to implementation of CMMC. And so with that, I thank you very much. And I'm prepared to take any questions that may not have been answered in the chat there.
Thank you, Kareem. That was excellent. That was such a thorough breakdown of not only the importance of cybersecurity, but also what Project Spectrum has to offer. So I do encourage all of you to go to their website, look at their resources, take advantage of anything that you can there. It's absolutely worth a gold mine. And yes, now is your opportunity to ask any questions that you may have missed out earlier on, or if you would like Kareem to repeat anything, or if there's anything else related to this topic that you just don't think we've covered yet. And while I'm waiting for people to type anything in the chat box, we've got a couple of minutes just to remind you that your Apex Accelerator counselors are also here to advise you. Obviously, we are government contracting experts. We are not cybersecurity experts, which is why it's so wonderful that DoD has brought Project Spectrum on board to assist us with this area. I will be sending out the recording, and I will be sending out, Kareem, are you going to send me the slide deck, please?
Yes, I apologize.
No worries.
He will do that for you. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
we'll
absolutely. All right. Well,
we just like to PDF it first. So we'll PDF it and send it over for sure.
Yeah. Great. I appreciate that because PowerPoint files can be huge. So yeah, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. And obviously you've got all the contact information there. So once you receive the slides and you think of anything, you can reach out to their team. So I'd like to thank Kareem again and Scott, who I believe is still on the call, for arranging this. We do appreciate you. We're hoping to have you guys do this training, again in the future. So thank you, everybody, and look out for my email with the information.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.